Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the hidden story of land, how it's been fought over, claimed, stolen, shared, and sacredly guarded throughout human history. Here's a question to start us off. What if the idea of owning land is actually one of the newest and strangest ideas in history? Long before the market economy, long before deeds and zoning boards and title insurance, land was not a product. It was a relationship. Let's go back, way back, to a time when the concept of land as private property didn't exist. For many indigenous cultures around the world, land wasn't something you could buy or sell. It wasn't real estate, it was reality itself. Sacred, alive, a shared inheritance, not a commodity. In North America, for example, many tribal nations held land in common. Families might use specific areas, but ownership, that wasn't the point. Land was a gift from the Creator, to be cared for, not divided, priced, or hoarded. In Aboriginal Australia, the land was part of what they call the dreaming, a spiritual map linking past, present, and future, life and law. You can't own the dreaming any more than you can own the sky. Now, contrast that with the way early empires treated land. In places like Egypt, Rome, or Mesopotamia, land was a source of power. It was parceled out to generals, to governors, to loyal citizens, sometimes as a reward, sometimes as a tool for taxation and control. The Roman Empire, in particular, used land grants to keep its massive military and bureaucracy loyal. Control the land, control the people. That was the unspoken rule. And then we have the moral frameworks, the religious blueprints for land and justice. In ancient Israelite law, every 50 years was supposed to be a jubilee year, where debts were forgiven and land returned to its original families. Radical, right? The idea wasn't to maximize profit, but to preserve social balance. The land was God's, and people were merely stewards. Similarly, the concept of the promised land wasn't just about territory, it was a divine covenant, a moral relationship between land, people, and purpose. So what ties all these models together? None of them were based on free market logic, not one. Instead, land was tied to tradition, spirituality, identity, and reciprocity. Whether it was managed communally through kinship, commanded by an emperor, or allocated by divine law, land was always part of something bigger than price. In fact, before land became a marketable asset, it was often seen as unownable in any permanent sense. The control of land reflected the values of the society, hierarchy or harmony, coercion or care. And that's what makes this history so important today. Because when we forget these older systems, we start to believe that the current one, based on ownership, scarcity, and exclusion, is somehow natural. I assure you, it is not. Stick with me as we trace how land went from a sacred trust to a speculative asset. Up next, how a few fences in England changed everything. Now, let's talk about one of the most misunderstood revolutions in human history, not a revolution of armies or flags, but of fences. Between the 14th and 19th centuries in Europe, especially in England, a quiet transformation was taking place, one that would reshape land forever. It was called the enclosure movement. So what was enclosure? Imagine vast open fields, common lands used by villagers for grazing livestock, gathering firewood, and growing food. These lands weren't owned in the modern sense. They were shared, seasonally managed, and governed by centuries of tradition. Then came the enclosures. Step by step, law by law, these communal lands were fenced off, literally enclosed, and turned into private property. No more shared pastures, no more seasonal planting. Instead, land was claimed by the gentry, the aristocracy, and rising capitalist farmers. What had once belonged to everyone suddenly belonged to a few. Now, this wasn't just a change in land management. It was a social earthquake. Families who had relied on common land to survive found themselves pushed out, with nowhere to go. And that's where the next piece of the puzzle comes in: peasant displacement. With their traditional livelihoods destroyed, countless rural people were forced into cities, fueling the rise of wage labor and the early industrial economy. These weren't voluntary migrants, they were refugees of privatization. The land they once depended on now had a lock, a deed, and a price tag. But this wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. Around the same time, thinkers like John Locke were laying the intellectual groundwork for this new world. Locke famously argued that mixing one's labor with land made it yours. If you worked it, you earned the right to own it. Sounds logical, until you realize who gets to define what working the land means. Hunting, grazing, ceremonial use, that didn't count. Tilling, fencing, producing surplus, that did. This shift in thinking made enclosure seem like progress instead of dispossession. And that's where law stepped in to seal the deal. Legal reforms codified this new reality. Parliament passed acts to formalize enclosure. Courts upheld it. And suddenly, taking land that was once held in common wasn't theft, it was progress. It was rational. It was civilized. Or so they claimed. But behind the paperwork was a pattern we've seen before, and we'll see again. power using law to reshape reality, systems of control hiding behind the language of improvement. So if you've ever wondered how the idea of private property became so normal, this is one of the origin points. The enclosure movement wasn't just about land. It was about changing people's relationship to land, from collective care to individual ownership, from shared survival to exclusion and hierarchy. And the ripple effects? Well, they're still being felt today. Up next, we'll see how this logic didn't stay in Europe. It was exported across the globe, with empire as the vehicle. If the enclosure movement was the spark, then colonization was the wildfire. Once Europe had redefined land as private property, the next question was simple: how much more could be claimed? Enter the age of empire. From the 15th century onward, European powers didn't just trade or explore, they seized. They planted flags on continents and declared, "This is ours now." But how? How do you legally and morally justify taking land already lived on by other people? The answer: clever theology and creative paperwork. Let's start with something called the Doctrine of Discovery. This was a series of legal and religious declarations, mostly by the Catholic Church, that said Christian explorers could claim any land not already ruled by Christians. If the people living there weren't European monarchs or baptized believers, they didn't count. They were, in the eyes of these documents, invisible. Then came terra nullius, Latin for nobody's land. European powers used it to claim that vast regions of the world were unoccupied or unused, even when they were clearly inhabited and carefully managed by indigenous peoples. Australia, North America, Africa, lands full of life and tradition, were deemed empty because they didn't fit the European model of ownership. No fences, no titles, no civilization, they said. And that's how you get settler colonialism. This wasn't just conquest, it was replacement. Colonists arrived not to integrate with existing communities, but to impose new systems, new maps, new laws. In places like the Americas, Australia, and southern Africa, indigenous land was seized and redistributed to settlers, complete with deeds, titles, and surveys. Native inhabitants were pushed to the margins, often quite literally, through reservation systems and exclusion zones. And how did they make all of this look legitimate? Through treaties, paper agreements signed under duress, in foreign languages, with hidden clauses and shifting terms. Many of these treaties were later broken, ignored, or simply erased from the record. But at the time, they provided a veneer of legality for what was, in many cases, outright coercion and forced removal. Then we come to the plantation economy. In the Americas and the Caribbean especially, land was fused with labor, enslaved labor. Colonizers didn't just take the land, they imported millions of Africans to work it. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, these were cash crops grown on stolen land with stolen lives. The profits fueled European wealth, financed industrialization, and entrenched racial hierarchies that still linger today. So let's step back for a moment. This wasn't just the theft of land. It was the global export of a new logic, that land could be claimed, owned, exploited, and if necessary, defended with guns, Bibles, or courts. It was enclosure, now with cannons, privatization, now with flags. The ripple effects are staggering. Entire nations reshaped, cultures displaced, ecosystems altered, and all of it resting on the idea that land, no matter how sacred or stewarded, was just a resource waiting to be claimed. But history doesn't stop there, because wherever there was dispossession, there was also resistance. Let's turn now to the people who fought back. Every time land was taken, someone fought to take it back. Because land isn't just dirt under our feet. It's memory, it's survival, it's sacred. And when it's stripped away, especially through violence or law, you better believe people rise up. Let's talk about resistance. In recent centuries, indigenous communities around the world have launched movements to reclaim what was theirs. This isn't just politics, it's about identity, sovereignty, and ancestral connection. Take the Land Back movement. Across North America, indigenous nations are asserting claims to their traditional territories. These aren't just symbolic gestures, they're legal battles, cultural revivals, and economic visions. It's a direct challenge to the structures left behind by settler colonialism. From Canada to the US, these communities are demanding not just recognition, but return. In Africa, the fight looked different, but the roots were the same. During the mid-20th century, anti-colonial movements swept the continent. Groups like the Mau Mau in Kenya and the African National Congress in South Africa weren't just resisting foreign rule, they were resisting land dispossession. For decades, colonial regimes had seized fertile ground and given it to settlers, pushing native populations into so-called native reserves or barren homelands. When independence came, those stolen landscapes didn't magically go back. So the fight for freedom was also a fight for restitution. Latin America tells its own story. Throughout the 20th century, peasant unions in countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Bolivia rose up to demand land reform. These weren't just protests, They were organized, strategic, and often incredibly brave. In many cases, peasants seized unused land directly, cultivating it themselves while pushing for legal reforms. They understood something essential. You can't have justice if the land is still concentrated in the hands of a few elites. And sometimes, just sometimes, resistance led to real change. There have been important legal victories in the struggle for land rights. Take Mabwa versus Queensland in Australia. That case overturned the myth of terra nullius and legally recognized Aboriginal land ownership for the first time in modern history. Or Standing Rock, where Native American tribes in the United States pushed back against pipeline development threatening sacred land and water. Even though the legal outcomes weren't always in their favor, the global awareness and solidarity were undeniable. What connects all of these movements? They're not just about reclaiming acres, they're about redefining legitimacy, challenging the systems, colonial, capitalist, bureaucratic, that claim to speak for the land, but never listened to the people who knew it best. And this struggle isn't over, not even close, because even in so-called democratic states, the game of land and power is still being played, just under a different name. Let's turn now to the modern state, and how something called eminent domain masks a very old story. So, the empires are gone, but is the land grab over? Not even close, because in today's world, the new empires wear suits and sit in city halls. The weapons are no longer muskets and flags, they're zoning laws, eminent domain rulings, and urban development plans. Let's talk about eminent domain, a legal doctrine that allows the government to seize private land for public use, so long as they offer just compensation. Sounds fair in theory, right? But in practice, it's a different story. Time and again, eminent domain has been used not for roads or schools, but for private real estate developments, luxury condos, sports stadiums, and pipelines. Often in low-income neighborhoods, often in communities of color, often without meaningful input from the people being displaced. Let's start with urban renewal. In the mid-20th century, cities across the United States bulldozed entire neighborhoods in the name of progress. What they called slum clearance was, in many cases, just displacement. Families who had lived in those areas for generations were forced out, their homes demolished, their history erased, and all of it justified on paper, as if the blight were a legal curse that needed to be cleansed. Then came cases like Kello versus City of New London. In that 2005 Supreme Court decision, the court expanded the definition of public use to include private economic development. In plain English, a city could seize your house and give it to a corporation if they said it would bring jobs or raise tax revenue. The Constitution didn't change, just the interpretation. So now, public use might mean a mall, or a hotel, or a tech campus with a glass atrium and a private security force. And what about infrastructure, highways, pipelines, power corridors? Governments and corporations love to say these projects are for the greater good, that they offer just compensation. But what's just about losing your home? What price replaces a sacred site? What number matches the trauma of losing a neighborhood where your children took their first steps? And here's where bureaucracy plays its most dangerous role. Through zoning laws and land use planning, governments can reshape entire cities with the stroke of a pen. They can consolidate land, restrict certain kinds of development, and designate areas for growth or redevelopment. But these processes often happen behind closed doors, guided by lobbyists, planners, and investors, not by the people who live there. And the outcomes? The same patterns we've seen for centuries. The powerful take, the marginalized lose, and it's all wrapped in the language of policy, progress, and legal procedure. This isn't medieval conquest, this is modern convenience. But the effect? Still loss, still silence, still exile. And now we arrive at a region where land is more than a legal question, it's spiritual, emotional, ancestral, and deeply, deeply political. Next, we turn to the flashpoint of sacred soil, Israel and Palestine. Few places on earth carry as much weight per square mile as this one. Israel, Palestine, the land where prophets walked, where empires rose and fell, where three major world religions trace their roots, and where one of the most enduring land conflicts in modern history continues to unfold. To understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have to look past the headlines, past the talking points, past the idea that this is just a religious feud or an ethnic clash, because at its core, this is about land. Who controls it? Who lives on it? Who gets to stay? And who gets to decide? Let's go back to the early 20th century. During the final years of the Ottoman Empire, this region was home to a diverse population: Muslims, Christians, Jews, living under Ottoman land codes. When the empire collapsed after World War I, Britain took control under a mandate from the League of Nations. And that's where things began to shift. The British issued the Balfour Declaration, supporting the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the same time, they made contradictory promises to the Arab population about independence and sovereignty. Two promises, one land. You can see the problem. As Jewish immigration increased, driven by persecution in Europe and a longing for a homeland, tensions grew. By 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan, dividing the land into separate Jewish and Arab states. But the plan was never fully accepted by the Arab world, and when Israel declared independence in 1948, war broke out. The result? Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced or fled. This event is known to Palestinians as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Entire villages were emptied, borders were redrawn, and those who lost their homes were never allowed to return. But the story doesn't stop there. Over the decades, Israeli settlements have expanded into the West Bank, territory considered occupied under international law. Homes have been demolished, olive groves uprooted, land titles rejected or revoked. And what's the legal basis? That's the twist. In many cases, Israel uses Ottoman-era land codes, British mandate records, or Israeli military orders to determine land rights. The result? A patchwork of laws that rarely favor Palestinians, a legal labyrinth that legitimizes expropriation while erasing history. Meanwhile, for many Israelis, this land holds profound spiritual and historical significance. It's not just policy, it's prophecy, it's survival. After centuries of diaspora, pogroms, and the Holocaust, the idea of relinquishing any part of the land feels like existential risk. So now you have two populations, two narratives, two historical traumas, and one shrinking piece of land. And it's not just sacred in a spiritual sense, it's symbolic. Every house, every hill, every checkpoint becomes a battlefield of meaning. And this raises the larger question, can law ever be neutral on land this contested? Or is every legal ruling a form of power, a reinforcement of one narrative over another? In the end, land here isn't just about territory, it's about memory, about identity, about the right to exist in place. And when you layer international politics, foreign aid, walls, checkpoints, and military occupations on top of that, well, you're no longer just talking about real estate. You're talking about a crucible of modern history. And yet, this conflict, like many others, is also shaped by something quieter but just as potent: economics. Let's now zoom out and look at the economic logic behind land scarcity, and who really benefits from the illusion that there just isn't enough to go around. So let's talk about land scarcity, because here's the thing, the earth hasn't gotten any smaller. There's still land, millions of square miles of it. Yet somehow, in city after city, we're told the same story: there's not enough. Not enough housing, not enough space, not enough land to go around. But is that really true? Or is land scarcity, at least in many places, not a natural fact, but a manufactured one? Let's break it down. In much of the modern world, especially in urban areas, zoning laws and land use regulations play a powerful but often invisible role. These laws decide what kind of buildings can be built, where they can go, and how tall they can be. Sounds reasonable, until you realize how these rules are often written. Many zoning codes restrict the construction of affordable housing, apartment buildings, or mixed-use developments in vast sections of cities. Instead, they privilege single-family homes, large lots, and strict height limits. The result? Artificial constraints on supply. And what happens when you restrict supply in a growing city? Prices go up a lot. Now here's where the economic logic kicks in. If landowners know their property is one of the few allowed to be developed, its value skyrockets. Not because it's inherently more valuable, but because everything else is off limits. The system creates winners and losers before a single shovel hits the dirt. And those who already own land, they benefit enormously. In fact, some of the most powerful interest groups in local politics are homeowners associations and real estate investors, people who benefit from keeping new development out. Why? Because scarcity boosts their property values. It's not a bug in the system, it's the business model. Now, let's zoom out even further. In many cases, governments impose land taxes, not based on the full potential of the land, but on its current use. That discourages efficient development and encourages speculative holding. Some investors sit on vacant lots for years, doing nothing, waiting for prices to rise. And if you think that only hurts poor people, think again. Land scarcity doesn't just inflate housing costs. It pushes people farther away from jobs, schools, and transportation. It segregates cities by income and race. It distorts where businesses can operate and how communities grow. In short, it reshapes entire economies from the ground up. Now, there are alternative ideas out there. Some economists have proposed land value taxes, where you're taxed based on the land's value, not the building on it. Others advocate for opening up zoning laws, encouraging more cooperative housing, or even restoring community land trusts. But these ideas often get buried beneath the status quo. Why? Because scarcity is profitable, and the illusion of scarcity gives power. It lets those who control land write the rules. And just like in the past, those rules often serve the few at the expense of the many. So when people say, "There's just not enough land," you have to ask, not enough for who? And who made that decision? Which brings us to our final reflection. What does land ownership actually mean today? Is it a right, a responsibility, or just another system of control dressed up in law, tradition, and market logic? Let's finish with some big questions. So now that we've traced land from sacred gift to state asset, to speculative commodity, let's ask the real question. What does land ownership actually mean? Is it a birthright? A legal fiction? A form of power disguised as paperwork? Because if we've learned anything from history, it's that land ownership is never just about who holds the deed. It's about who controls the system that decides what a deed means. Think about it. For thousands of years, land has been used to divide, to conquer, to organize society from the top down. From feudal lords to colonial empires, from real estate barons to governments with bulldozers and zoning boards, land has always been more than territory. It's been a tool of hierarchy. But what if we looked at it differently? What if land wasn't just something to be owned, but something to be shared, stewarded, and protected for future generations? What if we remembered that, for most of human history, land was sacred, not scarce, a responsibility, not a commodity? The systems we've inherited of private property, legal takings, exclusionary zoning, and speculative profit didn't fall from the sky. They were designed layer by layer, law by law, and they can be redesigned too. That doesn't mean utopia. It doesn't mean going back to some mythical golden age. But it does mean questioning the structures we treat as normal. It means asking, who benefits, who decides, and who gets left behind? Land ownership isn't just a matter of economics or legality. It's a reflection of deeper values. Do we build systems around power or around people? Do we treat land as something to dominate or something to belong to? That's the real truth behind history. Thank you for watching. If you found this video thought-provoking, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know what stories you want us to explore next. And if you're hungry for more history that challenges the mainstream narrative, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link down in the description. And remember, this isn't just about the past. It's about how the past shapes everything we think is normal today. So stay curious, stay questioning, and keep digging for the truth behind history.